Steve Kim for Undisputed Champion Network, and we are visiting with Larry Merchant in Santa Monica. Larry, I've never asked you this question, and I was just curious. When you were a young man or a kid watching boxing as a fan, who was your favorite fighter? Who influenced you the most?
Well, when I was a boy, during the Great Depression and World War II, I'm sorry, there were two great men in America. One was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president, and the other was Joe Louis. And I was a Joe Louis fan who listened on the radio, and I was even aware as a child of how important it was that a black man had become famous. He was the first, not just famous, but heroic black man in America.
So with that said, what do you recall of that night, his rematch with Max Schmeling?
Well, I was, I think, 7 years old, and my father came and said you could stay up to listen to the fight on radio. And even then, I was aware of, because vibes you had in the air from the radio, foreign correspondence about an oncoming World War II, and Hitler and the master race and all of that. And so I listened to the fight. It was a one-round fight, and as I've said, there were a lot of kids like me allowed to stay up to listen to the fight, and Joe Louis didn't want us to stay up too late, so he knocked Schmeling out in the first round.
Larry, you've been associated closely with a lot of fighters. As I go through these names, just give me your quick reflections on these guys. Muhammad Ali.
Well, you know, he was the Pied Piper. Everybody wanted to follow him, and he wanted to be followed. And he was a great athlete and an extraordinary personality, a very important social and cultural figure because of the times he came along, and in the 60s when the whole country was in tumult and things changing, and just there was just nothing like it. And over the years I've come to recognize that virtually everybody who came through that time has their own book in their heads about Ali and about being around him and going to the fights and putting him in the context of his times. He was an extraordinary figure.
Larry, here is a fighter that you were actually part of the management team of, Cloverleigh. So he was, for a short spell, your fighter. Smoking Joe Frazier.
Yeah, Joe Frazier won the 1964 gold medal in Olympics in Tokyo. He was actually a substitute who got in there because Buster Mathis, who had earned the shot, was injured, I believe. And he had come up from South Carolina to Philadelphia, which was a great hotbed of boxing with a deep infrastructure of gyms and trainers and sparring partners. And but he couldn't quit his job in a slaughterhouse to become a full-time professional because he had started a family. And so some local businessmen, lawyers, clerics got together and sold 80 shares at $250, a total of $20,000. Something like that happened with Ali in Louisville, where businessmen supported him early on. And I thought, as a columnist for the Philadelphia Daily News, that I would buy a share, and so that I could write about Joe Frazier as my fighter. And I had fun with it, and about 9 months, 10 months later, it happened that my tour of duty in Philadelphia ended, and I went to New York, and I needed money for a rental, and I sold my share for $2,000. But Joe never stopped kidding me about the fact that I sold out early because in 2 years the shares were worth $14,000.
Larry, that's why you were a sports writer, not a stockbroker.
Absolutely.
Larry, the four horsemen of the 80s, I envy you because you got to cover most of these fights. Ray Leonard, Marvelous Marvin Hagler, Tommy Hearns, and Roberto Duran. Just reflect on that quartet.
You know, they were the successors to Ali. Larry Holmes, who was a terrific fighter, but you could not follow Ali's act, or Frazier for that matter. Larry was a really good boxer and competitor. But Ray Leonard was he was an Olympic star, and Duran was recognized as a great lightweight. And then Hearns and Hagler came along, and they fought each other. Imagine that.
Novel concept.
And if it was a good fight, they fought again. That's one of the great things about Ali. Ali probably fought more big, strong, talented heavyweights than Lewis and Dempsey and Marciano combined. He fought everybody, and then he would fight them again. And that's the mark of a great fighter, not whether you won them all, but did you fight them all, and did you make yourself the center of the world for that moment.
That seems like a message to a certain fighter today. Anyway, here's a fighter that's close to your heart. I know that you were almost emotionally attached, and I think you were a pallbearer at his funeral, Arturo Thunder Gatti.
Well, you had to love Gatti. He was one of those fighters who comes along every once in a while, and he keeps going through hell and keeps fighting, and if you can do that and you have a punch, you got a pretty good chance of engaging people. And you know, Gatti was like a throwback fighter who people love to watch because they want to see how human beings deal with adversity. They want to see drama. They want to be moved in some way. And certainly Arturo Gatti did that.
Larry, one of your personal favorites of the past generation, and a guy that I remember watching the broadcast, you raised a lot of eyebrows when you compared him to maybe the greatest ever, Sugar Ray Robinson, a young man from Pomona, Shane Mosley. When it was all said and done, did he live up to the expectations that you had for him?
Well, I made a mistake. But in the sense that you don't lay that on anybody. You don't raise those kinds of expectations, and so that he's measured against whether you think he's as good as the best fighter who ever lived. And if he's not, then he's somehow fallen short and he's a failure. What I said at the time was that I had seen some tape of this young guy, and I said I don't recall seeing that combination of quickness and power and the way he could box and wanted to get in there and had a chin. And I said, let's see where he goes. You know, I wasn't declaring him that way, and it turned out that he was a pretty good lightweight, 32-0 with 30 knockouts. And had a pretty damn good career. I wish we had about a dozen like him now. We did happen to see his son fight the other night.
Yeah, Larry, we're all getting old. We're all getting old.
Got the biggest cheer of the night when he was introduced.
Larry, the Pac-Man, Manny Pacquiao.
One of the best fighters of his time. A real phenomenon. I think internationally the biggest celebrity fighter since Ali.
Really?
Yeah.
Bigger than Ray Leonard, Marvin Hagler?
Internationally, yes. Yeah. The impact he has is hard to measure. This little guy comes from the Philippines that nobody knows, and it's a typhoon, and it happened to come at a time when he was a featherweight, and the featherweights were the dominant force in boxing, and he fought everybody and then fought him again, and he had the kind of personality that people connected to, and he became a worldwide phenomenon. Now, not as culturally maybe important as Ali was back in his day, but because his fights were so thrilling, because his personality was so pleasing, and I just think there hasn't been anything like him for a long time.
And Larry, finally, a guy that you've had a love-hate relationship with, Floyd Joy Mayweather Jr.
Yes.
That's all. That's all you have to say about him.
Look, Mayweather is a terrific pure boxer. He's an even better matchmaker for himself, and an even better salesman who marketed himself and filled the void in America where there had been heavyweights. There is still a muscle memory in the sports world and in the boxing world for the big heavyweight championship fights, but there aren't any for Americans. And so I think that he was able to collect a big chunk of that and made himself the highest paid athlete in the world. I mean, it took some doing. As far as himself as a prize fighter, what I like to say is I like food, but I don't like all food. I like movies, but I don't like all movies. I like fighters, but I don't like all fighters. And while I respect and admire his dedication and his skill, there's just been too many fights when I found myself wasting the best part of an hour by being there after the second or third round.
Larry, final question. You landed perhaps the greatest counterpunch ever on Mayweather. When one of your last interviews, you said to him, if I was 50 years younger, I'd kick your ass. If that is ultimately the most memorable line, or the one that we're going to remember the most during your career, would you be okay with that?
I have no control over that. And I knew within 3 minutes that was going to be at least in the second paragraph of my obituary, if not the first. So it was spontaneous, and I like to say I'm just not smart enough to have thought it up, and it's followed me around for the last few years.